Bem, daremos início então ao painel 1, que tem como tema a nova ordem econômica mundial, impacto nas cadeias globais. Convidamos para compor o palco os senhores André, Gerdau e Johannpeter, Conselheiro do Instituto Aço Brasil, Vice-Presidente Executivo do Conselho de Administração da Gerdau e moderador deste painel. Convidamos também Edwin Basson, diretor-geral do World Steel Association. Também Márcio de Lima Leite, presidente da Anfávia. E Erik Hedborg, analista da CRU. Teremos também a participação online do Keynote Speaker, senhor Stephen Dover, estrategista chefe de mercado, head do Franklin Templeton Investment Institute. Senhores, por favor. Informaremos agora as regras de funcionamento do painel. O moderador terá 5 minutos para suas considerações iniciais. O Keynote Speaker terá tempo de 20 minutos para a exposição. Cada um dos debatedores terá um tempo de exposição de 15 minutos. Informamos também que as perguntas podem ser enviadas ao e-mail pergunta@acobrasil.org.br. Novamente, pergunta@acobrasil.org.br. Senhores, devido à dinâmica do evento e o fator tempo, para este painel não haverá debate, somente para este painel por enquanto. Obrigado e passo agora a palavra ao senhor André, Gerdau e Johannpeter.
Ok, bom dia a todos, bem-vindos novamente aqui para o nosso Congresso Aço Brasil. E depois dessa bonita abertura, vamos começar com esse painel, não menos importante, sobre a nova ordem global e as cadeias de suprimentos em geral. Tema que estamos acompanhando e vendo com muito interesse e que pode ser oportunidade ou ameaça, como tudo na vida. Estou aqui hoje, que já foi apresentado, com os panelistas, e vamos ter uma palestra do Stephen, que vai entrar por vídeo, e depois cada palestrante falará aí um pouco sobre o tema. O que eu queria colocar primeiro de introdução é o que nós temos visto nos últimos anos, é realmente uma migração, um mundo que era, ou ainda é muito globalizado, né, nos anos 90, 2000, onde muitas indústrias foram buscar custo e produtividade, e foram criadas cadeias globais, espalhadas pelo mundo, onde o comércio internacional cresceu muito, e onde se conseguiu, de novo, muito custo e produtividade. Mas também criou, junto com isso, uma grande dependência dessas cadeias e dos sistemas logísticos. E, nos últimos anos, principalmente causado pela pandemia, mas já antes, a gente começou a ver que nós passamos de um mundo onde sobrava e tinha produção para tudo e conseguia comprar tudo em qualquer lugar, para um mundo quase de escassez. Começou a faltar containers para transportar, a falta dos chips para os carros, problema de energia, que nós estamos vendo aí, também com a guerra na Ucrânia, né? A dependência da energia. E, ultimamente, nós temos visto um novo fenômeno ainda, que é falta de gente para trabalhar, em algumas economias, ou gente qualificada, ou até em quantidade para conseguir. Então, no mundo de que sobrava tudo, viemos para um mundo onde temos limitações nas cadeias, e limitações em várias áreas. Então, o painel hoje aqui vai se propor a debater quais impactos isso tem na nossa vida, nos países, na economia, nos nossos negócios e nessas cadeias, e nesses aspectos todos. Então, feita essa introdução, e eu esqueci de falar, mas é muito bom estar de volta aqui, vendo tanta gente conhecida, clientes, fornecedores, colegas do aço. Como é bom, depois de 3 anos, estar ao vivo e não mais por vídeo, porque vídeo cansa e nada como a interação pessoal. Então, pessoal, essa é a introdução. Eu já vejo que nós temos o Stephen lá no vídeo e ele vai começar a falar, então, a sua palestra. Stephen, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me at this great event. It was an incredible honor for me to be invited, but an even more incredible honor to listen to your president and some of the ministers. I have a deep love for Brazil, having lived in Brazil for 4 years, from 1997 till 2001, a time of a lot of volatility in the Brazilian markets, and have followed Brazil for a very long period of time. Today, I've been asked to talk about the disruptions in the global economy. And let me just give you a couple of caveats. I'm not an economist. I'm a strategist. I work for a global investment firm with $1.5 trillion that we invest around the world. And so my outlook is more from a strategist investment point of view than an economist's point of view. I would also, of course, like to say that I'm certainly not an expert in the steel industry, and will defer talking about that to the much more competent experts on the panel, and of course, even you as an audience. And so with that, let's look at how an investment firm or an investment analyst might look at the world and the disruptions happening to the global economy. I have a presentation. We'll be talking for about 15 or 20 minutes. And so if you'd please put the presentation up, thank you, and advance to the next slide. Of course, we have some short-term disruptions to our global economy, all of which you know, all of which were even referred to in the talks of the president and the previous speaker. The oil and gas prices continue to trade in a very high range. We'll talk a little bit in the future, but the flows of oil and gas is being recalibrated. And this will have significant impacts on many countries around the world. The GDP of the globe has been hit by the pandemic and somewhat by the war in Ukraine, between Russia and the Ukraine. And this has somewhat been limited by money given to individuals in most countries, including in Brazil. But that is now phasing out. Inflation, something we had not heard about for almost 30 years, is still a major concern. This impacts the interest rate cycle and will be something we'll probably be living with for the next few years. And then trade issues, which of course highly impacts your industry. There does seem to be a revival of trade, particularly between the United States and Europe. Next slide, please. Of course, we have to look at long-term disruptions as well. The severe sanctions that are being placed on Russia really disconnect Russia from the West. This is a structural change, something that will impact us for many years to come, and really a great pity, in my opinion, because at least in my experience as a globalist and someone trying to invest globally, we had great hope for the further integration of the West with Russia as well as with China. But Russia will grow its trade with China. But in our view, Russia is now a price taker in a very unequal relationship. China will dictate the terms with which Russia will be able to provide services to China. So it is not in any way an equal relationship. This changes something about the West as well, particularly in Europe, as Europe, which has not had big investments in defense, now changes to become much more militarized than it has been in the past. I think that probably German military policy that had been in effect since the end of the Great World War II changed within just a couple of weeks, which is dramatic. And the rest of Europe, of course, with new countries joining NATO, are changing as well. So NATO is stronger and bigger, and the cohesion of Europe is holding for now. Just a couple of years ago, if I was giving this speech, part of the talk would have been about whether the European Union will hold together. And now it looks like it has more cohesion than it has in the past. And of course, the growing tension between the US and China, it's really between the West and China. A lot of this is over technology. We'll discuss that. So while we look at trade, trade is global. Next slide, please. But it's increasingly governed by regional considerations. So the old idea of trade as trying to have an even playing field around the world seems to no longer be the way or the philosophy of trade. And now we have regional trade impacts, and even by countries that are not necessarily capitalist, if you will, or trade-oriented, they are also having regional trading considerations. I think one of the most important trade groups, if you will, is China's Belt and Suspenders initiative to try to build trade routes between China throughout all of Asia, Southeast Asia, and into Europe and Africa. That has been a big stimulus that China has given that part of the world. That's slowed down significantly and had very mixed success. The United States, while no longer interested in the same way that it was in global trade, is increasingly negotiating regional trade routes, the most recent being looking at increasing trade with Taiwan and with Korea. So I think the tariffs that we had over the last 8 years or so seem to be in place, and there seems to be a great popularity from them, but there's also an increase in trade around the world. The next slide, please. Of course, we're having a complete redrawing of our oil markets, which were primarily put into place. The markets that we've seen so far were primarily put into place in the early 1970s as OPEC was created and set up really the global system for how we change with oil. I think that one of the biggest changes for all the countries and the companies that we invest in is an increasing desire to bring back energy dependence to the country, and companies trying to be less dependent on services outside. So there is a change in global trade that isn't governmental, that actually comes from the companies and people themselves to try to protect their supply chains. On the next slide, we have to, of course, talk about the natural gas market. That is the market where we see probably the biggest opportunity in the last, 30 or 50 years for natural gas producers and the whole shift that that will have. If you look at countries like Germany and its entire economic theory, to make it incredibly simplistic, Germany was exporting to China manufacturing goods, and it was being able to do that based on lower labor costs from its eastern borders or the countries to its east, and very low energy costs from Russia. Of course, neither side of that is available to Germany and to Europe anymore. So there's a complete restructuring of what needs to happen in Europe. Next slide, please. And on top of all of that, and of course, part of the previous presentation slide, is the need to take into account the environment. It is, of course, very difficult for Europe, staring into the face of the coming winter, to also try to be environmentally responsible. But we will see some very big shifts in the use of natural gas that will have to come from other sources rather than Russia, and the use of many different resources. So that balance between the deep need for energy in the moment for the winter ahead, while still trying to have a long-term environmental policy, is a great challenge for Europe right now. And of course, next slide, please. This creates a tremendous risk for Europe of having stagflation. Stagflation, for those of you who don't know, is the really terrible economic situation in which you have both high inflation but low economic growth. Those slides are hard to look at, I know, but the huge peak in the slide on the left is really just showing that European inflation is highly caused by energy, whereas the inflation that we're seeing in the United States and some other countries has more to do with COVID supply chains, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. If we now turn to other areas where we're seeing or have seen great inflation, next slide, please, we'd have to look at food and the food index, which has risen sharply. It's also plummeted quite a bit just this last few weeks as the impact of the war in Ukraine on global food supplies has been less than originally feared. So a lot of the rise in food prices was more hoarding than it was actually an actual lack of supply, at least up till this point. Next slide, please. Of course, the impact of higher food prices is very unevenly felt, and it is likely to be much more heavily felt. Those are the countries on the left that are very sensitive to food prices, many of which would be in Africa or Southeast Asia, some of them being in Latin America as well. I would just say from a geopolitical basis that the Arab Spring and many of the uprisings that we have seen historically have been when food prices rise. So food security is very important. It's very important for us globally because when countries and people don't have food security, that often has geopolitical consequences. So next slide, please. Of course, then we have to look at how do we actually boost our food supplies. Whether we plant more or try to increase the yield, of course, even something like fertilizer is a very big issue with the war in Ukraine and Russia, which controls so much of the fertilizer for the world. And of course, that's a very important issue for Brazil as well. As we look at our food supply, that also gets complicated by the need to protect our environment. I'll say a little bit of an aside, but probably one of the biggest changes in how we look at investing globally today, certainly from 20 or 30 years ago when I was in Brazil, is the deep focus on the impact that companies have on the environment. Our investors are increasingly requiring us to invest in companies that don't harm or even help the environment. But even more than that, we have to look at the impact of governmental regulation or changes in the environment on companies. That's a really new thing. We call that ESG investing in the environment, social issues, and governance. One of the very interesting things for me, and where we've seen a lot of opportunities in the area of food, is the dramatic increase in technology to allow increases in harvesting. We have invested quite a bit in food technology, including these rather amazing vertical farming that can farm green vegetables inside of large buildings, very close to urban environments. Having myself grown on a ranch, I hadn't really realized the economics of agriculture and the importance of location and transport. So it can become economical, which you would not think at first, to actually grow vegetables, particularly in areas that are quite urbanized. This is, of course, particularly a big deal in the Middle East, in places like Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. Along with food, of course, very much is connected with water scarcity. I know that in general, Brazil is blessed with many resources, one of them being water, even though I know you've had some water shortages. But this is increasingly an issue very much linked to food dependency, has a very big impact on companies. We now, as part of our evaluation of companies that we invest in, do a water impact, how water scarcity or water resources might impact the company. That's a new way that we look at companies we hadn't before. It's increasingly important as we look at China, whose economic growth this year will be slowed because of water issues, among many other things. And here in the United States, in the western part of the United States, we have a tremendous water shortage, which is particularly affecting the Colorado River drainage area, which is the water resource for, among other places, Los Angeles, which will have to have some major water rationing. The next page, please. Of course, the battle, if you will, I don't want to necessarily use a military term, but the look at technological supremacy between the West and China has only heated up. And it's quite important. I made a talk maybe 10 or 15 years ago talking about our technology companies and how important they are. And I called them the new military companies, if you will, even though they're not the old style of military. it's certainly important to have technological supremacy to be able to defend oneself and to be able to grow economically in the future. One of the areas that might be surprising that I think China will have some superiority is in electronic vehicles. There's a lot of reasons for that. I spent a great deal of time in China, but just a couple things to think about that I found interesting is that China is so crowded and so populated, it can't fit very many vehicles on the road, despite it needs them. So electric vehicles, in some sense, make more sense in China because China, in order to have enough transportation with vehicles, will have to have ride sharing in a way that we don't have mostly in the West. And so a vehicle will be used for multi-purposes and used all the time. And so the ride-sharing company will actually be responsible for the charging, and the individual will just use the vehicle. So that makes an inherent reason why electronic vehicle adoption makes a lot more sense in China than it does in other countries. Next slide, please. This is an area that all of you know more about than I do, but it's just showing the dependency that many countries have on metals and materials. At least from an investor's point of view, and not being an expert on commodities myself, but the metals that we are concerned about have changed fairly dramatically as we move towards an environment where we have electric vehicles and batteries that need different minerals or need more of different minerals than we have in the past. If we could look at the next slide, please. The top X, of course, that harms countries that need to import them, but it helps, next slide, please. It helps the countries that are exporters. Unfortunately, for the West particularly, many of these countries may not be that stable, or many of them may not be friendly to the West. So that is a concern about how the West will secure its minerals. And of course, as an investor, we have to look at how companies will secure minerals. Next slide, please. Of course, the war in Ukraine has caused quite a problem because Ukraine and Russia are both major suppliers of many minerals and commodities that are strategic. And one area that hurts the world potentially is the great dependency the world has on Russia and Ukraine for semiconductor materials, but also for gases such as neon. So how we will adjust to that will be a serious issue as we look forward. And finally, I'd just like to finish, next slide, please, with what we see as we look at some of the long-term drivers of what will affect the economies of the world. Next slide, please. There is a saying that demographics is destiny. And if you look at the growth of countries, including Brazil, and the young country that Brazil was, certainly in the late 90s when I was working and living in Brazil, that just the demographics in and of itself is part of what drives an economy. What can slow an economy is having what's called a very high dependency ratio. And that just means the young people, but probably for the most part, the old people that aren't able to work and are therefore dependent on an ever decreasing percentage of the population that it is dependent on. And that is, I think, going to be one of the biggest economic situations that we go into. It's a very big issue, significant issue in Japan and Europe, the United States less so, but very serious. But even in parts of the world, such as Brazil, it's more of an issue, certainly, than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Next page. One of the great hopes that we have, but one of the changes that we have to keep on top of, is really the growth of automation. Next slide, please. The growth of automation and the growth of technology. Sometimes investors get ahead of themselves, investing in these companies and have too much hope in specific companies. But it's certainly the trend, and certainly where we need to look. And as a country, an area where Brazil, the future of Brazil, will somewhat be dependent on its ability to keep up with the technology of the rest of the world. Next slide, please. this is an issue that seems to always come up with politicians, but it is truly an issue. And if there's something that I'm convinced in my last 40 years of investing, is that tax policy really matters, that money does move, and incentives really do change as tax policy changes. But we are living in a situation where we now globally have fairly low tax levels compared to historically, but we also globally have incredibly high fiscal deficits that the governments are going to be inclined to either need to raise taxes and or have inflation to get themselves out of their debt. Next policy, please. And this is really my second to last slide, and that is I mentioned the big trend in investing, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That middle S, the social part of being part of a business has really changed, and companies are asked to have social missions in a way that they never have in the past. And that's very hard for companies, particularly politically, that they end up being on one side or the other politically, when companies really just want to focus on earning a good return for their shareholders. But this is a big change that is continuing and actually part of the analysis that we look at when we're investing. So final slide to just quickly summarize the big, deep waves that we see, next slide please, affecting investors and the economy over the next 5 to 10 years. If I could have the next slide, please. Are the demographic wave that I talked about, that's affecting all countries in different ways. Europe with its old age policy, China with its single child policy. But if you do look at economic growth over a period of time, demographics is a very large determinant. The technology wave and how it's used. Technology is hopefully an answer to both demographic issues, but also to increasing the productiveness of our economies. Ultimately, the only way we grow richer is to increase our productivity, and our greatest hope for that right now is technology. A slowdown in productivity and governments is a lot of debt, and certainly during this COVID period, governments around the world have increased their debt significantly. And as I mentioned, the way that governments traditionally get out of debt is either to increase taxes or increase inflation. And that does change the taxation wave. Brazil recently has done a lot of changes in its tax system to make it more efficient, and that's what a lot of countries are going to have to do. The geopolitical wave, of course, we've always had geopolitics, but geopolitics has become more personal, and it has become more indoctrinated into what companies need to do and how they need to respond. It's very difficult for companies. And finally, climate change is really now impacting companies, the climate change itself, but also something that companies have to look at from an investor's point of view. With that, I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'm happy for any questions, and I'm looking very much forward to the dialogue with the rest of the panel. I'm deeply thrilled for the changes that I've seen in Brazil over the last 20 or 30 years. I'm a big fan of Brazil, and I wish you all the best.
Alô. Muito obrigado, Stefan, pela sua apresentação, com uma visão mais de longo prazo, impactos globais. Nós vamos continuar aqui com o painel. O próximo a apresentar vai ser o Edwin.
André, thank you. Yes, thank you, André, and also from my side, thank you for the invitation to join you guys here in Brazil. It's always nice to come back. And certainly after all that we went through over the last 2 or 3 years, I think it's good to be in a region where steel is important. And secondly, it's good to also just report that globally, steel did not do so badly as a result of COVID. If I compare the performance of the global steel industry over the last 3 years, it's been quite sideways. There's been regional adjustments in between, but overall, it's been sideways. We're talking, however, of big macro changes, global changes, and how that impacts on us. And I'm going to, on top of the very, very interesting presentation that we had, just give quickly a view that I see very much happening in the steel industry. And I'm really looking at this at three layers. There's a bottom layer of what we call landscape changes in the global society. And essentially we see in this landscape layer 4 things happening. Economic activity and economic wealth is shifting from the Western world to the Eastern world. And alongside that is also the fact that populations are much higher in the Eastern world than in the Western world. So that's the first thing, the shift of economic power from West to East. The second thing that we are seeing in the same process is a shift from the countryside to the city. Now, this is a shift that's taking place a lot more in developing economies. We see, therefore, a lot of urbanization taking place in many of these developing economies, and many of them are closer to the east than to the west. And this is driving the way raw materials and resources are being used, and it's driving the way energy is being thought about in many of these societies. The third big challenge or change that we see is that technology is becoming smarter. So labor is still important, but it's not necessarily the one that drives all decisions anymore. It's about smart technology and the impact that has in the production environment. And then the last major landscape shift that we are negotiating, all of us, is that environment cannot be taken for granted anymore. It is becoming part of business, and it's becoming part of how we think of business into the future. On top of these 4 landscape changes, we are then seeing quite a number of the changes that we've spoken about in the presentation. Slightly more adjustments in how society is reacting to these landscape changes. The big one that we are beginning to see all around us now is a shift from globalization as a philosophy to regionalization as a philosophy, away from this the world is one place to something where the world is beginning to be broken up in different regions, or even in some cases countries. As a result of that, we are seeing something that we all spoke about 30 years ago, the so-called peace dividend. When the wall came down in Berlin and the world became globalized, we all started to invest less in defense. That's turning around, and our previous speaker mentioned this as well. There's a new focus on how we think about energy. Energy has always been important, but energy is moving away from fossil-based energy to new ways of energy. It's becoming intrinsically more expensive, and there are real questions that we have to think about how we are going to utilize energy in renewable ways in the future, particularly in industry, if we start thinking about the role of hydrogen and other sources. And these are questions at the moment that has potential answers, but there is a lot of hard work that needs to be done to make these answers real and make them practical. Now, how does all of this impact, very briefly, on our steel industry? I think, personally, we as an industry can gain from many of these issues. One of the key issues is that this shift away from globalized to regional focus brings a lot more focus and reliance to the steel industry in a country and in a region. It's back to what many of us grew up in this industry, where steel was seen as a local sense of pride, as a local driver of economic activity, and as a local source of training and development of individuals. To some degree, that was lost over the last 20 years. That seems to be coming back in many, many steel-based economies. The second thing that's coming back is that, yes, defense is important, but I think defense we should see more as a focus to be able to, for any society, to be self-sustainable, to be relying on itself, and to have supply chains that is resilient, that can deal or that you can trust in terms of good and bad times. So this change in terms of how we think of supply chains, how we think of where we get our raw materials from, and whether we are going to be willing as societies to pay a little bit more because we are not necessarily having the cheapest supply chain in the world, which may be the longest supply chain in the world. We are trying to move to shorter, more trustable, more resilient supply chains, and that could drive up costs in our systems in the regional evaluation mode. There's a question of local reliance on labor and on research and development. There was a phase, or we have possibly been seeing in the last 20 years or so, also a willingness to just drive for the best solution. And in many cases, this best solution was not necessarily developed by ourselves in the region or the country where we were living in. It was purchased in and came across the border. And I see this change towards regionalism, towards shorter supply chains, also beginning to drive in many countries in the world a refocus on how do we train our own future workforces, how do we think about technology development in our own country or region so that we have a future supply of thinking skills and technological skills in our region. And I think personally that's possibly one of the biggest benefits that societies can get, is that we are going to begin to reinvest in our own people again. And many of these things that we are seeing, for instance, the development of new energy systems, of new environmental systems, in Europe there's a key question whether there are at the moment sufficient artisans, if I can call them by their names, welders and boilermakers and so forth, available in the European environment to build all these new energy plants and DRI facilities that we would need to require to go towards a more environmentally friendly steel industry. For the last 20 years, any engineer thought that they had to go in IT if they wanted to make money. And these changes are now beginning to come back, and we have to retrain, redevelop skills that were available in many regions. Finally, maybe just one last danger that all of us in the steel industry have to think about. For as long as we know, the steel industry has also been, despite fragmented economies in the olden days, steel has always been a link between economies and between regions. And I think that link will remain. Historically, 1 out of every 3 tons that is produced crosses intercontinental boundaries. That went up in the time of globalization to something as high as 38%. It's now back to about 30%, which is the long-term average. That means 30% of what we produce as steelmakers is not used where we produce it, it's used in a different continent, not in a different country. If we take trade of products that has steel as an important input, there's another 40% historically that crosses international boundaries, whether that is in the form of vehicles or white goods or construction technology. So we are, as an industry, always relying to a large degree for at least 1/3 or more of what we do to be transported to a different continent. And therefore, it's in our benefit as an industry to ensure that these forces of regionalization do not break down our ability to have a fair and a rule-based open trade system on a global basis. So it's in our benefit as an industry to also continue to ensure that we ask for organizations like the World Trade Organization and others to continue to drive the set of rules within which we can trade and within which we can link to some degree our materials and what we produce to other regions in the world. So we are seeing quite a number of changes. I don't think it's necessarily bad for the steel industry, but it is going to be difficult to negotiate these changes. And I think there are a couple of things. Environment is one, rules-based trade system is the second one, and development in technology and new future labor are probably the 3 challenges that we would need to think about as an industry as part of what we will have to negotiate within this new environment. And with that, André, I give it back to you.
Muito bom, obrigado, Edwin. Muito boa explanação. E o próximo a falar é o Márcio aqui do meu lado. Fique à vontade, Márcio, para continuar. Depois nós voltamos aos temas. Você quer usar o púlpito, por favor? E só para lembrar a todos, nós vamos mudou um pouco aqui a agenda, e nós vamos ter, depois do fim das apresentações, mais 15 minutos. Então, quem quiser mandar suas perguntas, eu recebo aqui no iPad, o Perguntas Aço Brasil, e a gente faz aqui para os palestrantes, e vamos ter alguma dinâmica de perguntas e respostas, então. Por favor, Márcio, está contigo.
Bom dia a todos, muito bom dia. Muito obrigado, Marco Polo, pelo convite, é um prazer estar aqui. Geralmente, os eventos, a Anfávia, representando o setor automotivo, quando a gente encontra com alguém na rua, alguém comenta, olha, meu carro está com problema, o carro subiu de preço, então a gente é muito demandado. E eu hoje me sinto completamente à vontade por ser o cliente de vocês. Então eu me sinto em casa e eu tendo o poder de ser bem tratado e cobrar dos senhores e das senhoras como cliente. Bom, eu queria, em nome do André, cumprimentar os meus colegas de mesa. Muito obrigado, André, é um grande prazer estar aqui. Também gostaria de aproveitar, cumprimentar todas as senhoras e todos os senhores, em nome da Silvinha Nascimento. Gostaria de cumprimentar o senhor Jefferson de Paula pelo novo mandato, pelo novo momento que se inicia no Instituto Aço Brasil, desejando-lhe sorte. Também Sérgio Leite, parabenizando o Marcos Faraco pelo brilhante período à frente do Instituto Aço Brasil. Bom, a nossa indústria hoje representa mais ou menos 24% do aço produzido e consumido no Brasil. O desafio da indústria do aço, certamente não é menor do que o da indústria automotiva. Por quê? Porque nós somos irmãos, nós estamos ligados umbilicalmente. A nossa posição do Brasil hoje, em termos de mercado, nós ocupamos 7º e 8º lugar em termos de consumo e também em termos de produção. O mercado do aço, hoje o Brasil é o 9º em termos de produção, então nós temos situações bastante parecidas e também nós temos desafios em comum. O nosso setor vive o momento mais disruptivo da história desde a sua criação. Anotem bem, o nosso setor, o setor automotivo e, consequentemente, o setor do aço, nós vivemos o momento mais importante de toda a nossa história. O Brasil conta com uma cadeia de fornecedores excepcional. Nós temos hoje o estado da arte quando falamos de produção de automóveis no Brasil, naquilo que é tecnologia, naquilo que é desde a concepção de um produto, passando pelo design, pelas todas as fases de engenharia, até a sua produção e a sua utilização como consumidor final. Nós competimos igualmente com qualquer indústria no mundo. Nós temos uma questão que precisa e está sendo enfrentada, é a competitividade. A competitividade dos nossos produtos, ela tem melhorado, nós estamos vendo um progresso significativo nos últimos anos. Ocorre que nós temos, nesse momento, o maior desafio que é em função de rotas tecnológicas. Quando o mundo passa a abandonar o motor a combustão e o mundo começar a demandar por novas tecnologias, eletrificação, como já decidido na Europa, Estados Unidos caminhando também em outra velocidade, mas caminhando para a eletrificação, Ásia caminhando para a eletrificação, nós temos que ter em mente que o Brasil terá uma fonte, ele terá um leque enorme de tecnologia. Nós temos no Brasil o etanol, que quando analisamos do poço à roda, o etanol ele é tão verde, ele é tão limpo quanto o veículo elétrico. Quando trabalhamos, é melhor, então, o etanol, a combustão, o híbrido, do que o veículo elétrico? De forma alguma. Todas as tecnologias estarão presentes no Brasil. O veículo elétrico é uma realidade e será no mundo, e que seja muito bem-vindo. Devemos estimular, devemos trabalhar com infraestrutura. O veículo a combustão, ele não é o bad guy da história. Quem é o bad guy da história é quando nós falamos do processo de emissão de carbono. Quando trabalhamos com o etanol e o híbrido etanol, nós temos uma eficiência em termos de descarbonização tão boa quanto a eletrificação. Porém, ocorre que o Brasil, ele já há algum tempo, o preço dos produtos é um preço elevado. O Brasil tem caminhado para um acesso ao automóvel apenas para a classe mais alta. O automóvel ficou caro. A população passou a ir para os veículos velhinhos, com mais de 9 anos de uso, veículos com mais de 12 anos de uso. Isso teve um aumento absurdo nos últimos anos, e isso é um problema grave em termos de emissão de carbono e segurança veicular. Então, nós vivemos um contrassenso. Nós vivemos grandes metas para o produto final, e que bom que o seja, isso deve ocorrer, mas quando analisamos toda a frota começa a emitir mais carbono. Emitir por quê? Porque ela envelheceu. Essa frota envelhecida é o maior mal que nós podemos ter em um país. Porém, é a maior oportunidade. Nós temos que ter e trabalhar com o que nós temos no país, buscando enfrentar o nosso inimigo comum, que é emissões de carbono. Nós temos que trabalhar para a descarbonização, nós temos que trabalhar principalmente para a reindustrialização do nosso país. Se nós não tivermos um olhar para a reindustrialização, para a indústria local, nós vamos sofrer uma avalanche de saída de investimentos do país. Então, o cenário é negativo? De forma alguma. O cenário é absolutamente positivo quando nós analisamos a oportunidade que nós temos nesse momento. O mundo caminhando para a eletrificação e descontinuando a produção de automóveis a combustão no mundo. Agora, os países em desenvolvimento não têm infraestrutura. Os países em desenvolvimento não terão pelos próximos 20 anos. E é hora do Brasil ocupar esse lugar como um grande produtor e um grande exportador de veículos, de automóveis, de alta performance, de alta capacidade, como nós sabemos fazer, como nós temos indústria instalada, como nós temos do aço, do minério, até o veículo na ponta. Então, nós temos que ter o foco de exportação. O Brasil, em termos de competitividade, ele ocupa hoje a 30ª posição em termos de país exportador de automóveis. Nós somos 7º produtores, 8º em consumo, e temos hoje a 30ª posição. Então, nós temos um potencial enorme para avançar em termos de produção e em termos de exportação. A indústria do aço é parceira. Hoje, quando analisamos um automóvel, 50% do peso ele vem do aço, ele vem da carroceria. Isso, nos últimos anos, houve uma grande evolução. Em torno de 20% nós conseguimos reduzir esse peso. Por outro lado, isso não é perceptível, isso não é visível, porque nós tivemos que agregar novas tecnologias, novos equipamentos de segurança no automóvel. Então, o peso do automóvel hoje ele é mais ou menos o mesmo que ele era no passado. Porém, ele avançou em termos da tecnologia do aço. São aços de alta performance, são aços com maior resistência, mais flexíveis. Então, nós temos hoje um grande avanço, e é o avanço da indústria do aço em parceria com a indústria automotiva. Quem diria indústria do aço por tantas vezes sendo premiadas como inovação, como investimento em tecnologia, em pesquisa, em desenvolvimento. Essa é a parceria do setor automotivo com o setor de autopeças. Mas isso ainda vai muito além. Na semana passada, nós estávamos eu, Marco Polo e alguns colegas do Grupo Coalizão, entregamos ao ministro Paulo Guedes um prospecto falando sobre a questão de semicondutores. A indústria automotiva sofreu um baque nos últimos anos, nós perdemos mais de 11 milhões de veículos, de produção de veículos no mundo. 11 milhões deixaram de ser produzidas e consumirem o aço porque faltou semicondutor. Semicondutor passou a ser aquela famosa amêndoa do filme da Era do Gelo, todos atrás de semicondutor, porque houve, no momento da pandemia, um aumento considerável na fabricação de outros produtos, como laptops, celulares, porque as pessoas ficaram mais em casa e tiveram que investir, e essa demanda aumentou, a indústria automobilística praticamente 3 meses paradas, então semicondutores foram direcionados para outros mercados. Não bastasse isso, houve fábricas de semicondutores que pegaram fogo na Ásia, e depois a questão de logística e lockdown. Então, a questão de semicondutores é um problema. Nós já tivemos, somente esse ano, 24 fábricas paradas, foram mais de 400 dias de inatividade de todo o setor. Então, esse é um desafio da indústria automotiva e um desafio também das senhoras e dos senhores. Por quê? Porque a nossa indústria está junto, a nossa indústria não dá para separar. O Brasil tem um grupo trabalhando para a atração de investimentos de semicondutores para o Brasil, e este deve ser o nosso tom. É nisso que nós temos oportunidade de trabalhar. O mundo procurando investimento em fábricas de semicondutores, e nós temos, como país, uma fábrica em Minas Gerais, chama-se Unitec. Essa fábrica nunca operou. É uma fábrica pronta. É uma fábrica que tem todos os equipamentos, todos os maquinários, que está em processo de recuperação judicial. Ela foi inaugurada, veio a pandemia e foi encerrada, e o mundo querendo produzir semicondutores e não tem possibilidade, porque há fila de espera para a obtenção das máquinas para a produção de semicondutores, e nós temos isso no Brasil. Isso é um dos exemplos daquilo que a gente tem no Brasil, da força que a gente tem no Brasil, e muitas vezes a gente não utiliza. O Brasil tem tudo para sair como um grande produtor de semicondutores. Essa fábrica hoje ela é de posse do BNDES, e o outro sócio é BDMG, Codenge, tem outros sócios envolvidos. Qual que é o olhar do setor privado? O setor privado tem que cobrar, tem que ser parceiro do poder público, tem que levar alternativas. Traga investidores para analisar o que nós temos. Agora, por exemplo, está indo uma comitiva ao Japão, e um dos motivos é apresentar o que nós temos de riqueza, o que nós temos de oportunidades para a nossa reindustrialização e ter uma aceleração no desenvolvimento do nosso país. Isso é uma realidade. Recentemente, tivemos alguns executivos da Anfávia visitando o Vale do Jequitinhonha para ver a reserva de lítio que nós temos, que é uma das maiores do mundo em termos de reserva de lítio, que é o futuro, é uma das alternativas para o futuro da eletrificação. Todos atrás dessa amêndoa, que é o lítio, que também é extremamente relevante. E qual que é a ideia do país? Nós vamos exportar lítio ou nós vamos exportar produto manufaturado e elaborado? Aí vem a primeira questão. O Brasil não tem demanda para bateria elétrica. Mas como não tem demanda, todas as montadoras que estão no Brasil têm também sedes fora do Brasil. Nós, setor privado, temos a obrigação de trazer as nossas matrizes e falar, olha, aqui no Brasil nós temos um potencial de indústria, nós temos que industrializar, nós somos competitivos, nós temos insumos, nós temos qualidade, nós temos uma indústria de base, criar uma massa para exportação e depois utilizar para consumo próprio. Nós não podemos cair nos erros lá de trás, por exemplo, até hoje o Brasil não ter produção de transmissão automática. Somos o 7º e 8º país em termos de produção e de consumo e temos uma indústria riquíssima, componentes de primeiríssima qualidade e ainda dependemos da importação para aquilo que é o básico da indústria automotiva. Então, a nossa conversa hoje é uma conversa de gente grande, é uma conversa, é hora de ter um foco, é hora de reindustrializar o país. Se nós perdermos esse momento, nós não teremos outro, porque fábricas irão encerrar suas atividades, irão importar produtos, e nós defendemos os fabricantes de veículos automotores. Nós defendemos aquilo que é feito no Brasil. Importação é importante, é fundamental. A importação ela traz tecnologia. Nós temos que defender, sim, a vinda de baixos volumes. Nós temos que defender veículos premium, aquilo que nós não temos capacidade e nem escala para a produção local. Mas qual que é o maior desafio? O nosso desafio é colocar o país de novo na rota da industrialização. Nós temos um projeto que foi denominado, junto com o Sindipeças, ainda é apelidado, ele não tem ainda esse nome, mas é de volta para o futuro. Qual que é a posição nossa da indústria? Nós vamos sentar e lamentar ou nós vamos apresentar propostas e trazer para uma industrialização mais próxima? A nossa ideia, quando de volta para o futuro, é colocar aquilo que nós temos no país e apresentarmos para as nossas matrizes lá fora. Então, cada montadora vai chamar o seu diretor de compras global, o seu principal executivo, e nós vamos apresentar. Vocês sabiam que pesquisa e desenvolvimento no Brasil hoje ocupam grande participação no mercado global? Várias montadoras exportam serviços do Brasil de pesquisa e desenvolvimento. O software da Maserati, por exemplo, ele é produzido e feito todo no Brasil, boa parte no Brasil, e ocupa aquilo dos carros mais luxuosos do mundo, e produzidos pelos brasileiros. Então, nós temos competência, temos competitividade e precisamos reduzir o custo estrutural, que é o custo Brasil. Eu estou aproximando da minha fala final. O Brasil teve progresso importante, isso é importante que a gente ressalte a todo momento, tanto para nós quanto para os investidores. O nosso setor está investindo 55 bilhões de reais e o nosso objetivo é aumentar essa fatia e nós temos que ser porta-voz do que está acontecendo. Nós temos hoje reforma previdenciária, nenhum país conseguiu fazer a reforma previdenciária como nós conseguimos. No silêncio, a reforma previdenciária caminhou, e isso é motivo de muito orgulho para nós, brasileiros. Redução do IPI, fundamental. A redução da carga tributária é fundamental se queremos ser um país de ponta. Nós, indústria, porque eu me lembro de quando essas propostas saíram, inclusive o Marco Polo, um grande defensor dessa questão, veio a cabotagem. A cabotagem houve um momento muito importante de avanço e uma ruptura com todo o sistema que tínhamos até então. Nós conseguimos implementar a cabotagem, que é hoje fundamental. Adicional do frete da Marinha Mercante, isso também foi uma proposta que foi levada pelo setor privado e hoje é uma realidade. Então, o adicional do frete da Marinha Mercante era um custo que havia, um custo significativo, e hoje nós temos uma redução considerável. O programa de renovação da frota, se nós queremos trabalhar com descarbonização, que é o nosso inimigo comum, na preservação de um mundo melhor para os nossos filhos, para os nossos netos, é fundamental trabalhar no programa de renovação da frota com inspeção técnica veicular. E hoje nós temos já uma realidade para pesados e nós temos que trazer isso para os veículos leves, para então retirarmos esse consumidor que está indo para o veículo velhinho com mais de 10 anos de uso e aumentando significativamente o processo de emissão de gás carbônico e trazer para uma nova realidade. A mesma coisa com desoneração tributária. Então, essas eram as minhas considerações. As rotas tecnológicas, previsibilidade, esses são os nossos principais desafios, né? E algumas pessoas, outro dia um jornalista perguntou: Márcio, você não é muito otimista ao estar colocando essas oportunidades frente aos desafios e o risco que nós temos? Eu me lembro sempre de uma frase do Ariano Suassuna, quem eu adoro e acompanho sempre, de vez em quando eu gosto de ler alguma coisa sobre ele, porque dou boas gargalhadas e é um ensinamento constante. A diferença entre o pessimista e o otimista é que o pessimista sofre por antecipação. E nós acreditamos em um país melhor, acreditamos que podemos colocar o carro no trilho novamente e seguir firme para um país mais competitivo e em parceria com a indústria do aço. Muito obrigado a todos vocês. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Márcio. Muito boa apresentação. Erik, you next.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I have a presentation that I want to share, and there we go. So I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit here in the interest of time. My name is Erik Hedborg. I'm a principal analyst at CRU, and I'm head of our primary and secondary steel research. Today, I want to talk a little bit about these supply chain issues that we've addressed here earlier today. We've seen a lot of that happening in the last few years. War in Ukraine, we had COVID-19. We have more recent supply chain disruptions with droughts and other things of that nature, including industrial strikes that we're seeing in many parts of the world. So I want to talk a little bit about how this is going to impact the global steel industry. First, we have a legal notice. This is boring, so I'm going to skip it and talk a little bit about who we are at CRU. So we cover mining, metals, and fertilizers, and we do analysis and consulting projects. As you can see on this map, we do have offices all over the world. So we cover the entire steel value chain, all the way from mining to the production and sales of finished steel. And we have a strong global presence as well. Now, when we talk about the steel industry, one thing I want to do here is zoom out a little bit. I want to take a step back and look at the history of the steel industry. So if you look at this chart, which is very interesting, I want you to focus on the blue line first, because that is the cost of producing steel for the highest cost producer in the world, the marginal producer. And they are the ones that do set the price of any commodity, basically. So you can see that line moves up and down throughout the years, mostly based on the price of iron ore and metallurgical coal. The yellow line, that is the price for steel, in this case hot rolled coil. And you can see that that price follows the cost of steel production very closely. However, we had a few periods in the past of a detachment, a significant detachment between prices and costs. 2008, we had industry reforms in 2016 to 2018. And more recently, of course, the COVID-19 recovery. Steel demand going up very quickly, going very high very quickly, and steel suppliers unable to respond to this quick rise in demand. And therefore, you saw extremely strong margins for the steel industry in 2021. What I want to point out here as well is that we are in a correction phase right now. Steel prices are coming down. Steel margins are coming down as well. So this correction phase feels quite painful at the moment because it's obviously not as good as the market was 12 months ago. But still, looking from an historical perspective, we're still in a pretty good place right now. When we talk about steel, of course, we have to talk about China. And on this chart, you can see global steel production, crude steel production, and you can see the rise of Chinese production there from year 2000. Now, this is quite interesting because during this time, China's steel production has gone from 100 million tons per year up to over 1 billion tons per year. Whereas in the rest of the world, steel production has been pretty flat. I also put India there on the chart, and you can see India is far away from China, and India is currently the second largest steel maker in the world. So it's a market that is completely dominated by China, of course. Now we're starting to see the Chinese steel industry struggle quite a bit here recently. The real estate market is not performing well. Households, they're very invested in this real estate market. They're holding on to their money a little bit more now, not spending as much as they used to. Also, if you look at the global markets, we're now seeing weaker demand for steel-containing goods all over the world. Higher interest rates, higher inflation. We already bought that car or that dishwasher in the last couple of years. So internationally, yes, we're seeing weaker steel demand, and there are fewer export opportunities for Chinese manufacturing industries. Another thing there that has happened is that China has tried to prevent this decline in real estate by issuing stimulus measures, but they've had a very limited effect because of COVID-19 lockdowns in the country, of course. So that is reducing China's ability to sort of prevent an economic downturn. Some of these stimulus measures will have an effect later on, but they will be less steel intensive than what we have seen in the previous sort of 10 to 15 years. Another thing that stands out when you look at this chart is that Chinese steel prices did not increase to the same extent in 2021. So that's where we saw a fantastic market in many other parts of the world, but in China, things were not as good. And now if we look more recently, what has happened in the steel industry in terms of margins for steel makers, they are really low in China. Still at a pretty good level. If you look at the European Union, for example, the United States, here in Brazil are also in a pretty good place. But in China, margins have been negative for about 4 or 5 months now. So steel makers are losing money on every ton of steel that they're producing over there. And there must come a point in time when steel makers start cutting production. We're seeing that happening right now in the market. Also in China, I said they had COVID-19 lockdowns. That is affecting economic output, but it's not having much of an impact on supply chains in China anymore. So supply chains in China are operating better than they used to in the past. Also, we're seeing a lot of industrial strikes in many parts of the world. That is one aspect that doesn't really exist in China. I want to talk a little bit more about the margins in the steel industry and looking at the price of steel versus the cost of steel. So on this chart, we have plotted the cost of producing steel in different regions. So the Chinese steel makers, they are the blue ones. You have the green ones, which are the European ones, and then the orange are the United States. I also included Brazil there, which are the black producers. So you can see here, the price for steel varies in different regions, of course, and that tells you a little bit about the margins. In the US, still pretty good margins. In Europe, you see the price of hot rolled coil is now slightly lower than the cost of hot rolled coil for some of these producers. And we're starting to see European steel makers adjust, especially the highest cost ones. In China, the situation is obviously much worse. You see a price of $600 per ton for hot rolled coil. That is much lower than the cost of producing that steel for many, many Chinese steel makers. And again, like I said before, they're starting to reduce production now. This production kept pretty high throughout Q2, but now in July and in August, we're seeing lower steel production levels in China. So what does this mean for the steel supply chain? Well, lower steel production in China means lower demand for steel-making raw materials, including, of course, iron ore and metallurgical coal. We're seeing both those two commodities decline quite a lot, and those are the ones that drive the price of steel. So both iron ore and metallurgical coal are in decline at the moment. And one thing that's quite interesting about these two charts is that we saw the peak for iron ore and metallurgical coal be in different years. Iron ore peaked in 2021, and metallurgical coal peaked earlier this year. So there's a bit of a sort of different dynamic in the two markets as well. Now, if we want to understand why are prices falling and why did they fall at different times, we need to look at the supply side for these commodities. And we're going to focus on the export market, of course. Starting with metallurgical coal. You can see here who the biggest producers are in the world, or the biggest exporters, I should say. Obviously, we got Australia, account for over half of global met coal exports. Production there has been quite low. They've had a very heavy rainfall, similar to what we've had here in Brazil earlier in the year. And that has affected Australian production. Also, Russia used to be the second largest exporter of metallurgical coal. Their exports have now declined. They're struggling to find alternative destinations for a lot of these met coal exports. that they mostly sold to the European market previously. And also, like I said, supply chains in China are working a little bit better now. China is getting more metallurgical coal from Mongolia, for example. They didn't have that in the past, but now that supply has improved. So overall, we're seeing relatively weak supply of metallurgical coal, but the demand is falling at a much faster pace, and therefore met coal prices are coming down. Now, if we move over to iron ore, which is of course very interesting because Brazil is a significant supplier of iron ore. Not as big as Australia, of course, and if you look at these two countries, production has been okay. Australia has been better than last year, Brazil a little bit worse, but overall these two countries that account for over 80% of global iron ore exports, production has been in an okay state. It's actually the smaller countries there that have struggled with production and exports. Ukraine, Russia, and now Indian iron ore exports are also in decline. So overall, iron ore supply has struggled a little bit as well, but prices are still coming down. Again, that is because of the weak market, especially in China. And China accounts for over 70% of global iron ore imports. Now this brings me to another topic when we talk about supply chain, and that is the war in Ukraine. So if you look at the chart now, I've highlighted the market share for Russia and Ukraine in these two commodity markets. For iron ore, they're not that big. A combined market share of 3-4%, but for met coal, much bigger. Last year, Russia accounted for nearly 20% of global met coal exports. That also helps us to explain why iron ore has been relatively steady this year, and met coal prices have been extremely volatile, especially as the Ukraine war started. Another thing that the Ukraine war has brought, of course, is high energy prices. We talked about that quite a lot already. We see higher oil prices, we see higher thermal coal prices, natural gas also increasing. That is having a short-term impact and a longer-term impact on the market as well. Our view is we're going to have to live with these higher energy prices for longer. So shorter term, electric arc furnace producers in Europe, they're losing competitiveness relative to the steel makers that are charging iron ore and met coal. So that is the change that we're seeing in the market. Again, I want to focus a little bit more on Europe here because we're seeing some interesting developments there in terms of DRI investments. There are a lot happening there, hydrogen-based DRI investments. Many of them were supposed to use natural gas initially and then gradually replace it with hydrogen. And of course, this is very energy intensive. And also the natural gas supply situation in Europe is not great at the moment. Going back to iron ore, I want to talk about one more thing here, and that is we often hear from our clients and people in the market that because of the higher energy prices, the cost of producing iron ore is higher, and therefore the price of iron ore should be higher as well. Now, we fundamentally disagree with that view based on some analysis that we've done. So let me explain why. This is a cost curve to produce iron ore. And like I said earlier, the price of any commodity is set by the marginal producer in the market and their costs. If you look at the marginal cost of production in iron ore, that is mostly Chinese iron ore producers. They have no exposure to the freight market. They have lower energy prices, or energy prices have not increased as much as in other parts of the world. They have a lot of underground mines, so they have lower diesel consumption, and now they have a renminbi depreciation. So Chinese iron ore producers, which are the marginal producers, their costs have not increased that much. Cost for producers in Australia, in Brazil, for example, they've increased a lot more. So it's the bottom of the cost curve, that's where we've seen the increase, whereas the top of the cost curve has not risen that much. Now that means, obviously, yes, the cost of producing iron ore has increased, but that does not suggest that we should see a higher iron ore price going forward. Now, one thing I want to talk about here, or just to summarize what I've talked about, we are still in the correction phase in the global steel industry. Margins will continue to come down and align more with cost in the future. In China, it's a bit the other way around, where margins have been very negative and they will come back to a sort of a healthier level there. We're going to have to live with China slowing down as well. In the future, we're going to see stimulus measures will continue, but they will be less and less steel intensive, and the steel intensity in the Chinese economy will decrease as well. And just like with COVID, we've learned to live with COVID in many parts of the world, we're also going to have to learn to live with higher energy prices. That will have an impact on the steel industry, especially in Europe, where we see the steel industry was planning to move to a structurally different steel industry with much lower carbon emissions. That is becoming increasingly more challenging now. And similar, when we talk about sort of reducing its reliance on Russian energy, we're also going to see steel makers reducing their reliance on Russian iron ore and Russian coal in the future as well. For iron ore, it's less of an issue. For metallurgical coal, that poses some challenges. And finally, we're starting to see iron ore and metallurgical coal prices now come down to a more normal, a healthy level. Iron ore should be around $100 per ton. That's part of our forecast. Metallurgical coal, still volatile, but they're sort of around $250 per ton right now. We think there's room for those prices to continue to decline here towards the rest of the year as well. So that means steelmakers know what they will be paying for raw materials in the future. We're going to see less volatility going forward. And of course, that means that we'll have more predictable steel prices. Now, in terms of the margins in the steel industry, one thing I just want to say here at the end is that margins in the steel industry, they are not driven by the price of raw materials. We disagree with this view. Margins in the steel industry are driven by this fundamental supply and demand of steel, and they have very little to do with the cost of iron ore and met coal. Cost of iron ore and met coal, they drive the price of steel, but not the margins for the steel makers. So, that was exactly 50 minutes. I'm actually quite impressed right now. So, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Erik. Obrigado. Como é que nós estamos de tempo? 15 minutos ainda? 5 é difícil fechar. 15. Então, podemos fazer as perguntas. Ok, vieram algumas perguntas aqui da plateia, tem alguns comentários. Eu vou começar uma para o Márcio Leite. Ele tocou no assunto, mas a pergunta também para reforçar que com a guerra e Covid, que se ele acredita no reshoring, que é uma tendência automobilística, é uma indústria global com produção, mas ele mesmo falou da transmissão automática que não produz no Brasil, que seria um típico caso de trazer. Quais impactos você vê no reshoring, se é uma tendência, e que tipo de investimento se esperar? E imagino principalmente para o nosso Brasil aqui.
Essa é, sem dúvida, uma grande oportunidade para o nosso país, né? O Brasil ele é um grande produtor, de uma forma geral. Nós temos aquilo que interessa ao mundo como produção de bens. E, com esse fenômeno guerra, Rússia, Ucrânia, houve e está havendo uma busca cada vez maior por uma menor dependência de determinadas regiões. Então, é natural, nas empresas percebe-se uma busca por preço, por custo, isso é fundamental e haverá sempre, mas não é apenas isto que vai ditar a regra do jogo, como nós nos últimos anos trabalhávamos, né? Menor preço, menor custo, e aí a gente acabava tendo uma concentração em determinadas regiões. Hoje, naturalmente, isso não acontecerá mais. Nós vemos o exemplo dos semicondutores, tende-se a normalizar até julho do ano que vem, mas mesmo com a tendência de normalização, busca-se uma produção pelas diversas regiões no mundo, os Estados Unidos fazendo seus investimentos, o Brasil também, inclusive, deve sair uma medida provisória nos próximos dias tratando sobre semicondutores, outras regiões também intensificando a produção. Então, esse rearranjo da cadeia global, ele está acontecendo, vai acontecer de uma forma muito mais rápida do que a gente viu nos últimos anos. E o Brasil ele é um país amigável, ele é um país que tem boas relações com o mundo e possui também uma boa capacidade, tanto industrial como tecnológica e também como produção mineral. Então, acredito plenamente que isso é muito e será muito benéfico para o nosso país.
Muito bom, Márcio. Obrigado, bom ouvir. Erik, uma pergunta para você. E, de alguma forma, você mostrou os ciclos. E a pergunta é que houve muita volatilidade nos custos de matéria-primas, preço do aço nos últimos tempos por causa da pandemia e desarranjo das cadeias. E a pergunta é se nós podemos... existe alguma previsão de que haja mais estabilidade nos preços, tanto de matérias-primas, aço, no mundo nos próximos anos?
Is it working? Yep, very good. Yes, so we had a couple of extremely volatile years, both in iron ore and metallurgical coal, driven, of course, by the supply chain disruptions that we've seen, very strong steel demand, resulting in very strong demand for iron ore and met coal. And that sort of period is basically, coming to an end now. So we're going to see much more stable prices for iron ore and for met coal going forward. Also, the suppliers of those two commodities have started to adjust production. They've been able to increase production, so the upside for those two commodities will be limited going forward. Now, what does that mean for the steel industry? Like I showed you before, that sort of blue line, which is the cost of steel production, will also start to stabilize, because cost of producing steel driven by iron ore prices and met coal prices. One thing I want to point out here is that there are sort of regional differences here as well, and we're now seeing a more regional markets in many sort of aspects. We talked about that before as well. I think it's quite interesting, and it does have an impact on iron ore and met coal as well. For example, now we've seen India imposing export restrictions on iron ore. So you will start to see steelmakers in different regions paying different prices for some of these commodities as well. But overall, we're looking at a world where we're going to see much more stable prices now compared to, obviously, what we've seen in the last 2 years.
Ok, thank you. Uma pergunta agora para o Edwin, pouco sobre o que ele comentou do comércio mundial, que ele falou dos níveis que cruzam fronteiras, principalmente entre continentes, que era 30%, foi para 38%, e em peças ou máquinas, veículos que contêm aço é quase 40%. Mas também esse número, imagino, no passado longínquo já foi 5%, 10%, quando o trade no mundo era muito menor. Como é que ele enxerga isso e que níveis ele imagina que possamos ir?
Yeah, thank you, André. Let's split the two. If we talk about trade of steel, this is in coil or bundle or in whatever format, this is, in the old days, the lowest that it's ever been. If we go back about 30 years in our data, has been around 26%. So that means the lowest that international trade has ever been as a portion of steel sales on a global basis was about 25%. 1 out of every 4 tons of steel crossed a border. And if I say crossing a border, we're talking about crossing continental borders. It is put on a ship and it is taken to another continent. If you just talk about crossing a country border from here to Argentina or wherever else, then the figure is higher. But let's talk about intercontinental trade. So the lowest that it was ever was about 26%. This was in a day when there were lots of obstacles to trade and so forth. As the world became freer and open, more open in the last 20 years or so, this figure of 26% went up, and the highest that it's ever been was about 38%, about 5 years ago. And it's then started sliding back, and we're now sitting at about 30%, which is about the long-term average of this figure. So whether we like it or not as steelmakers, we must accept the international market is always part of what we do. And we've always said the steel industry is probably the most open in the most competitive market on an international basis, because we all buy our raw materials from the same places. We all use technology that's been in place if you're in a blast furnace operation for the last 300 years and is very efficient already. And if you're an EAF operator, it's a technology that's been in place for the last 80 years or so. So we're a very competitive industry, and therefore international trade is part of what we do. It keeps us all, as some people would say, it keeps us all honest. But I think this is something that we have to also think about for the future. If we are going to try and begin to protect our markets too much in line with this regionalism that we are beginning to see on a geopolitical basis, we may start running into trouble of efficiency, access to raw material, access to technology, and so forth. So it's important for us, I believe, to keep the markets as open as we can get it and keep it as fair as we can get it. And the World Trade Organization rule-based system has worked well for all of us. The second step is, where does steel go to? In many countries, we use steel to produce products, whether it is, we used the example of automotive, but it's also yellow goods, it's also shipping, it's also trains, and so forth. And that market of steel using goods is actually even more open than the steel market. There, on a weighted average basis, over the last 30 years or so, it's been sitting between 39 and 42% of all products made from steel has been exported across continental boundaries. Now, these are cars, ships, trains, and whatnot. And I suspect that bit is going to continue to be very open to international trade, because as developing countries grow, they have a need for the technologies that sit in more developed economies, and they import it. And only at the end of their economic growth phase do they begin to replace these technological goods that they import. So countries like Brazil, most of the Western world, will probably, for a long period of time, continue to be technological suppliers to most of Africa, to big parts of Asia, big parts of the Middle East. And I think this trade bit is going to stay in place. And therefore, I think we have to recognize that we're in an international and globally competitive market also into the future. And we have to protect our access to those markets.
Thank you, Edwin. Bom, estamos chegando ao final, eu vou fazer um fechamento aqui, ou tentar um resumo, porque foi muita informação, muita coisa interessante. Espero que todos tenham gostado. Começando pelo Stefan, que falou sobre as ondas, né? Sejam as ondas da batalha tecnológica, a dependência da população, né? Que é algo que nós estamos começando a ver no Brasil, já não é um país mais tão jovem, as ondas de impostos, seja na geopolítica, de global para local. Então, muito interessante essa visão global também das dependências de gás, supply e demand. Já o Edwin nos falou mais sobre o aço, né, nas 4 pontos, um deles que a gente já conhece e cada vez vem maior, que é a migração para o leste, para a Ásia, né, onde está toda a grande concentração de produção e consumo de aço e crescimento, os impactos tecnológicos e esse fenômeno do campo para a cidade, que no Brasil já é bem menor, já aconteceu, mas em muitos países na Ásia, e isso gera muito consumo de aço quando existe a migração das populações para a cidade. E ele reforçou agora, na pergunta, essa parte do comércio mundial, que mesmo com essa tendência de reshoring, de ser mais local, regional, vai continuar, de alguma maneira, a existir. O Erik nos falou sobre os ciclos do aço, que quem trabalha no aço aqui conhece muito bem, né? Que tem anos muito bons e muitos anos muito ruins, e tem que saber lidar. E que as correções não terminaram, seja nos preços, no supply and demand, mas ele prevê alguma estabilidade. E já o Márcio nos falou aí toda a indústria automobilística, das oportunidades de investimentos. Interessante esse ponto da eletrificação e etanol, né? O Brasil tem o etanol como uma grande fonte de energia renovável, que, se for bem usada, pode ser muda o jogo, mas tem que ver como isso é feito com investimentos, políticas públicas e assim por diante, né? Mas a eletrificação também vem. E ainda nos falou 2 boas notícias aí da indústria de semicondutores, que tem em Minas Gerais, que é possível ativar, já está construída. Isso no mundo praticamente não tem nenhuma indústria construída pronta, todo mundo correndo atrás para ter chips que faltaram, e também das minas de lítio, que é outra grande oportunidade para o Brasil transformar. E, para finalizar, eu acho que o ponto, olhando para o nosso Brasil, né, me lembro do ex-ministro Delfim Neto, que sempre nos trazia as fortalezas de um país estão na segurança alimentar, segurança energética e segurança bélica. O bélico a gente achou que não ia mais precisar quando a gente vê aí um conflito na Europa, mas a indústria do aço é uma indústria importante e estratégica. E o Brasil tem tudo isso. Então, se a gente olha tudo que a gente ouviu nesse painel dos potenciais, eu diria que o Brasil tem uma grande oportunidade de aproveitar essas mudanças das cadeias globais e produzir no Brasil, reshoring. De novo, temos alimentos, temos energia, temos a capacidade. Um grande desafio é a redução do nosso custo Brasil para viabilizar e sermos mais competitivos e eficientes. E, mais importante de tudo, temos as pessoas para fazer. E é isso, pessoal. Muito obrigado pela presença. Esse foi o painel das cadeias globais e nós vamos ter muitos outros painéis e debates importantes. Muito obrigado a todos. E aos panelistas.